The quiet suburb of Amityville, nestled along Long Island's South Shore, was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved from their driveways, and where the American dream seemed alive and well. Wide lawns stretched out in front of two-story colonial homes, the salty air of the Atlantic drifting in from the nearby bay. Families grilled in the summer, children rode bicycles down Ocean Avenue, and church bells marked the slow turning of Sundays. Among these homes stood 112 Ocean Avenue, a stately three-story Dutch colonial with its now famous quarter-moon windows that gazed out over the neighborhood like watchful eyes. In 1965, the property was purchased by Ronald DeFeo Sr., his wife Louise, and their children. For all appearances, the DeFeos embodied the aspirations of a prosperous Italian-American family. They had money, style, and presence. Ronald Sr., often called Big Ronnie, was the archetypal patriarch. A burly man with a booming voice, he carried himself with an authority that demanded respect, or, more accurately, obedience. He had worked his way up in the Buick car dealership owned by Louise's father, Michael Briganta, who was both wealthy and well-connected. With his father-in-law's support, Ronald provided his family with a lifestyle that many in Amityville envied. Expensive cars, lavish clothes, and a home that seemed plucked from the glossy pages of a magazine. But behind the polished veneer of the DeFeo household lurked something darker. Big Ronnie's temper was infamous. He had a brutal way of asserting control, lashing out physically and emotionally at his wife and children. Neighbors occasionally overheard shouting matches through the walls, and relatives later recalled that visits to the DeFeo home were often tense, dominated by the unpredictable moods of the patriarch. Louise DeFeo, in contrast, was more reserved, though her submissive posture toward her husband sometimes gave her the appearance of a shadow in her own home. She loved her children deeply, but her attempts to shield them from Ronald's wrath were often futile. The DeFeo children, Ronald Jr., nicknamed Butch, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew, grew up in this storm of wealth and violence. Out of them all, it was Butch, the eldest son, who bore the brunt of Big Ronnie's expectations. Butch was expected to follow in his father's footsteps, to carry the weight of family honor and success. But as he grew older, it became painfully clear that Butch was not the golden son his father demanded. At school, Butch struggled with academics and was often ridiculed for his slow progress. Socially, he was awkward, retreating into himself and simmering with resentment. By his teenage years, Butch had developed a reputation for volatility, much like his father. But while Big Ronnie's anger erupted outward, Butch's boiled internally until it became something more corrosive. Friends described him as a boy caught between privilege and pressure. On one hand, he had every material advantage. On the other, he was suffocated by the oppressive control of his father. The strain between the two men often led to explosive confrontations. Sometimes these clashes turned physical, with screaming matches escalating into outright violence. The younger children, frightened and powerless, learned to shrink into the background when these storms erupted. As Butch entered his late teens, his behavior grew more alarming. He began skipping school, dabbling in drugs, and displaying an increasingly defiant attitude. By the time he reached his early 20s, he was heavily using heroin and LSD, sliding deeper into paranoia and detachment. His relationship with his father had deteriorated into open hostility. Louise and the younger siblings watched helplessly as the tension in the house thickened, coiling tighter and tighter, like a spring waiting to snap. Yet from the outside, the DeFeos still looked like a model family. They drove Cadillacs, dressed in expensive clothes, and attended church on Sundays. Big Ronnie, despite his reputation for violence, often boasted about his family's success. He wanted the world to see the DeFeos as powerful, prosperous, and untouchable. But the truth was far uglier. The house on Ocean Avenue was a crucible of control, anger, and fear. The children lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when their father's temper might ignite. Butch, spiraling into addiction and rage, began to talk openly of hatred toward his father, muttering darkly about revenge. He had access to guns. Ronald Sr. had bought him a .35 caliber Marlin rifle for hunting, and he had begun to fantasize about using it for something far more sinister. By the fall of 1974, the atmosphere in the DeFeo home had grown unbearable. The arguments were louder, the violence more frequent, and Butch's instability more dangerous than ever. Relatives noticed, friends noticed, even neighbors noticed, but no one could have predicted just how horrific the culmination of this tension would be. The house on 112 Ocean Avenue, with its charming facade and picture-perfect lawn, was about to become the stage for one of the most infamous crimes in American history. And in the weeks and years that followed, it would become more than just the site of a massacre. It would be transformed into a legend, a house whispered about in classrooms, documented in courtrooms, and dramatized in Hollywood. But before the whispers of hauntings and tales of demonic possession, there was only the DeFeo family, bound together by blood, torn apart by violence. The murders at 112 Ocean Avenue on November 13th, 1974, would forever scar the quiet town of Amityville. What began as a seemingly ordinary autumn night ended in bloodshed that shocked not only Long Island, but the entire country. The DeFeo household carried its usual tensions into the evening. At dinner, neighbors would later recall hearing muffled voices raised in anger. Inside, Big Ronnie once again belittled his son. Butch, 23 years old, absorbed the insults in silence. His father's contempt had become unbearable, and his drug-fueled paranoia left him teetering on the edge. That night, while the rest of the family drifted into slumber, Butch sat awake, consumed by rage. The house was silent except for the rhythmic barking of the family dog, Shaggy, chained outside. A rifle rested within his reach, a .35 caliber Marlin, the same gun his father had once proudly given him. At around 3:15 a.m., Butch entered the master bedroom. His father lay beside Louise, asleep and defenseless. Raising the rifle, Butch pulled the trigger. The first shot thundered through the house, striking Ronald Sr. and waking Louise in terror. She had only a second to register the horror before Butch fired again, killing her instantly. Butch then moved methodically from room to room. Dawn, 18, shot in her bed on the third floor. Allison, 13, killed with a single shot to the head. Mark, 12, executed as he slept, his crutches resting beside him. John Matthew, 9, the youngest, slain without stirring. 6 lives extinguished in less than 15 minutes. Each victim was found face down, arms tucked beneath them, as though they had been forced into that position. What unsettled investigators most was the lack of struggle. Not one of the DeFeos had attempted to flee. None had cried out. Neighbors, though close enough to hear, reported only vague thumping sounds. The Marlin rifle had no silencer. Its blast should have woken the entire block. Autopsies revealed no sedatives. Toxicology showed the victims' systems were clean. They had not been restrained, nor were there defensive wounds. The silence defied explanation. How could a man fire 8 deafening shots in a 2-story home, killing 6 people without anyone moving from their beds? Some police speculated that multiple shooters had been involved, or that a strange chemical agent might have been used, but evidence of neither was ever found. The mystery of that silence remains one of the most haunting aspects of the DeFeo murders. Aftermath. After killing his family, Butch showered, changed clothes, and disposed of the weapon in bloody clothing. He went about his day as though nothing had happened, showing up at work, complaining of boredom, even contacting friends. Later that evening, he staged his performance of discovery. Bursting into a local bar, he cried out, "You gotta help me. I think my parents have been shot." A group of locals followed him back to the house where the grisly discovery was made. The 911 call was placed, and within minutes, the Amityville police arrived. Detectives who entered the house described it as a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked the sheets, the smell of gunpowder still faint in the air. One officer later admitted he could barely keep his composure. At first, Butch blamed the mob, insisting his father's underworld connections had led to the killings. The story seemed plausible on the surface, but cracks appeared quickly. Butch's timeline was inconsistent, his emotions oddly detached. The turning point came when police discovered the murder weapon in a storm drain near the house, wrapped in a bedsheet. The rifle was traced directly back to Butch. By the next day, the facade crumbled. Interrogated under pressure, Butch shifted his story repeatedly. First, he claimed his mother was responsible. Then he blamed his sister Dawn, saying she killed the family before he killed her in retaliation. Finally, he confessed outright, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop." It went so fast, even in confession, Butch added a chilling twist. He spoke of voices in the house, whispers that ordered him to kill, that compelled him beyond reason. "Greater than, it wasn't me," he told detectives. "The voices made me do it." Whether the voices were hallucinations born of drugs and mental illness, or something darker rooted in the house itself, would become the fuel for everything that followed. The trial, the media frenzy, and eventually the legend of the Amityville Horror. By dawn, news of the massacre had spread across Long Island. Reporters gathered outside 112 Ocean Avenue. Photographers captured the house with its quarter-moon windows staring coldly at the street, a place that already seemed haunted by its own silence. Amityville, a town once associated with peace and suburban comfort, became synonymous with horror overnight. Parents clutched their children tightly. Neighbors whispered about evil in the house, about how they had felt something strange in that place even before the murders. The DeFeo murders were no longer just a crime. They were a rupture in the fabric of suburban America. The dream of safety, of a perfect home in a perfect town, had been shattered in a storm of gunfire. The guilty verdict sealed Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s fate. 6 consecutive life sentences ensured he would never walk free again. The people of Amityville could breathe a little easier, or so they thought. Yet even as Butch sat behind bars, the unease never left the town. Police officers whispered about what they had seen, or rather, what they had felt inside the house. Journalists noted that Butch's story shifted constantly. Sometimes he was the killer, sometimes he blamed a shadowy figure. Other times he insisted voices in the house had commanded him. And then there was the most unsettling question of all. How had 6 people been shot, one by one, without a single cry for help? The DeFeo house stood silent, but its silence was not peaceful. Neighbors swore they sometimes saw movement in the upstairs windows. Others claimed the house gave off an energy, a cold, suffocating heaviness that made them cross the street rather than walk past. A priest who had blessed the property during the investigation later admitted he had left abruptly after hearing a deep, guttural voice command him, "Get out." And so the house waited, empty, watching. To the outside world, the case was closed, the murders solved, injustice served. But to those who lived nearby, there was an unshakable sense that something inside 112 Ocean Avenue had not ended with the trial. The DeFeos were gone, but whatever had whispered in the darkness that night was still there.